Now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O God, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. Back in the early 60s, Marshall McLuhan wrote a book, Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. And in that book, he made a radical claim that has often been misunderstood. He said that the media is the message, or the medium is the message. And some people took that to mean that the medium trumped the message, that it was more important than the message. But what he was really saying was that there was a symbiotic relationship between the medium and the message. An example is watching a crime being reported on the nightly news. There is nothing more gripping than to see a mother of a murdered teenager being interviewed right at the deepest part of her grief. I'm guessing that if you poll most of the people in this country and you ask them what was happening with violent crime in the United States, you would get the response that, well, it's on the increase. But the reality is, it's been on decline for almost a decade. But we keep seeing these images every night on the television. And because that medium is so personal and so powerful, the subtle underlying message that we sometimes don't even recognize that we're receiving is that this is a really dangerous place to live. We are most conscious of the obvious, but oftentimes it's that subtle underlying message that really has the greatest impact. Recently there was a book published where the author is making the argument that this is the safest time in human history to live. Based on studies that have been done of what percent of populations died violent deaths, this is just about the safest time in all of human history. But does it feel like it? Toward the end of the 60s, Andy Warhol, artist slash pop culturalist, can you say that word? Came up with a line that's become famous, which is interesting because of the line. In the future, everyone will be world famous for 15 minutes. And we all kind of laughed and said, well, there's Andy again, grabbing the headline with some silly catchphrase. What's kind of scary is that it's sort of come true. I don't think Andy could have foreseen the impact of the internet. But we have example after example after example of people becoming world famous because of some silly thing that they have put on the internet. A silly song or a silly dance. Unfortunately, sometimes the things that people become famous for aren't so. The young man was just convicted of a hate crime because he videotaped his roommate, college roommate, having a homosexual encounter and put that on the internet. And then his roommate committed suicide. Sometimes people are so hungry to become famous, they become infamous. Our whole culture seems predicated on this these days. All of these, quote, reality shows. How many people can you name who are famous for being famous? Does the name Kardashian ring a bell? Or is it, help me out here, is it Snooki?
Yeah.
Yeah. Famous for being famous. It's like there's a whole group of people in our society that feel their lives are meaningless unless somehow they get some notoriety. But think of the media and think of the message. Is there anything more ethereal than the internet? It kind of goes out into the stratosphere somewhere. Doesn't ever seem to go away. And there certainly isn't any bringing it back. What is glory? What does it mean to be glorified? The people of Israel, people of Judah, they had broken their covenant with God in every imaginable way. Israel had been defeated by the Assyrians and the entire population carted off into exile. Judah then suffered a similar fate by being conquered by the Babylonians and hauled off into Babylon, where they would remain for 70 years. And Jeremiah, who had predicted this, and had been sorely persecuted because he predicted it, now turns around and to the very people to whom he was preaching doom, is preaching hope. And he says, God is going to reestablish his covenant with the children of Israel. But this time, instead of it being carved in stone, it's going to be carved in their hearts. And that would be the more direct translation here instead of right. Cut into their hearts. Think of the medium and the message there. If it's carved into your heart, it's unforgivable. It becomes a part of who you are. How you act, how you think, how you respond to other people. Some Greek Jews, part of that dispersion that happened hundreds of years before. People who maybe had never ever been to the Holy Land before, who had never been to Jerusalem, possibly fulfilling a lifelong dream of celebrating Passover in Jerusalem, had arrived. And they had been hearing about this guy Jesus. And when they explored the possibility that maybe they might meet him, they ran across two of his disciples who had Greek names. Philip and Andrew. And they asked Philip and Andrew, could maybe we meet with Jesus? And so these two go and tell Jesus about these folks that would like to meet him. And Jesus has this interesting response. Now has the time come for the Son of Man to be glorified. What brought that on? What was Jesus' mission and ministry in the world? It was to proclaim the good news of God. Not to just Israel, but to the whole world. And these Greeks' interest in Jesus foreshadowed the impact that his actions in the next few days, the next day, would have on the whole world. And what did it mean for the Son of God to be glorified, for the Son of Man to be glorified? The prophet Isaiah, speaking to the same audience that Jeremiah was speaking to, shares this in chapter 52. Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up and greatly exalted. And then 3 scant verses later, who has believed our message, and to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a tender shoot, and like a root out of parched ground. He has no stately form or majesty that we look upon him, nor appearance that we should be attracted to him. He was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and like one from whom men hide their face. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely our griefs he himself bore, and our sorrows he carried. Yet we ourselves esteemed him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was pierced through for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The chastening for our well-being fell upon him, and by his scourging we are healed. Behold, my servant will prosper. He will be high and lifted up, and greatly exalted. That's some kind of strange exaltation, isn't it? Mm-hmm. This idea that the medium is the message. That somehow the medium adheres in the message. Well, in Jesus' case, I would say he turned that around. Instead, he took the message and made it adhere into the medium. You see that phrase, high and lifted up, has a double connotation. It can mean set upon the throne, or in Jesus' day, hung on the cross. Lifted up was a euphemism for crucifixion. And so Jesus comes to this moment and he says, now will the Son of Man be glorified. And should I ask for this hour to pass from me? No, this is why I came. Because in order for God to write His covenant on our hearts, to carve it into our hearts, He had to write it large on an instrument of shame and torture. And the glory of God and the sacrificial love of the Son transformed that instrument of torture into a beacon of hope for a dying world. Jesus said, "If I am lifted up, I will draw all people to me." This is one of those paradoxical phrases that occurs in the Bible, and particularly in the Gospel of John, where sometimes you get this judgment scene where all these people are going to heaven and all these people are going to hell, and then you get passages like this, which are universal. I will draw everyone to me. How could such an act of self-denial and sacrificial love by the co-eternal, pre-existent Son of God not be effectual? The secret of glory is that there is only one glory. All the other things that people aspire to, the fame, the recognition, that's just a light mist that burns away in the light of Christ's love. No other glory counts. No other majesty matters. And the only way that you and I can experience glory is if we share in Christ. Not through self-promotion, but through self-denial. Not through actions that we take to attempt to aggrandize ourselves, but rather to deny ourselves and to put others first. Nelson Mandela spent 27 years in prison. Every one of those days, at any minute of any hour, he could have expected to be tortured or killed. Nelson was raised in Christian school. He has written that his faith and the Christian principles that he learned were what strengthened him and what guided him. And he became one of the greatest emancipators in human history. Not only freeing his race from bondage in South Africa, but once he was released and became president of South Africa, rather than following the example that had been followed countless times before of taking retribution and putting his jailers in jail, instead leading one of the greatest acts of forgiveness and reconciliation that the world has ever witnessed. That's glory that counts. That's glory that transforms. And that's the secret of glory. There's only one that matters. And its power and influence are universal and eternal. Julian of Norwich, one of the greatest Christian mystics in the English tradition, she lived in the latter part of the 14th and the very early part of the 15th centuries. Believed that Christ came to her and spoke to her on numerous occasions. And one of the most famous messages that she received from him was this: all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. Through the glory of Christ, through the power of the one who is our King, our High Priest, and our Sacrifice. In Jesus' name.